Depuis le début, on a évoqué quelques interrogations qui ont guidé nos réflexions et programmes pour cette année. La centralité de la performance et ses liens avec la magie, les processus artistiques qui se nourrissent de ces traditions et qui en retour les enrichissent, mais aussi les liens entre magie et technologie. Ce matin, on va continuer à approfondir ces questions à travers des figures artistiques qui nourrissent les pratiques contemporaines. Nous n'allons pas beaucoup nous éloigner de la Californie ce matin parce que Stephanie Seidel, que nous avons le plaisir d'accueillir ce matin, va nous parler du travail de l'artiste Betye Saar, qui est née en 1926 à Los Angeles et dans la pratique a marqué le champ de l'art contemporain. Donc le travail de Betye Saar entretient un lien puissant avec le rituel, c'est ce que Stéphanie va nous montrer aujourd'hui, et ça a été un fil rouge de sa pratique. Stephanie Seidel, qui est chercheuse et curatrice, connaît extrêmement bien ces questions, puisqu'elle a notamment curaté, il y a quelques années, une très belle exposition dont nous avons, je pense, le catalogue ici, qui s'appelait Betye Saar, Serious Moonlight, qui a eu lieu à l'Institute of Contemporary Art à Miami aux États-Unis, au FRAC de Metz dans l'est de la France et au Kunstmuseum Luzerne. So Stephanie, thank you for joining us this morning. You are a curator and researcher. From 2016 to 2025, you were a curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Miami, where you curated numerous exhibitions, including surveys on Olga Diamaral, Judy Chicago, Diamond Stingley, Zilia Sanchez, and Betye Saar, which was titled Betye Saar Serious Moonlight. Starting January 2026, you will serve as the head of contemporary art at Kunstmuseum Basel, so you will be closer to us. You are member of the Betye Saar Legacy Group, an international committee of curators and scholars founded in 2025 that is dedicated to preserving, interpreting, and advancing Betye Saar's oeuvre. And in a way, this is what you will be doing in a few seconds. So thank you so much for joining us, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to Luma and to Saima, Flora, Franny, and Julia, and the entire team here at Luma for this wonderful conference. I'm really excited to be part of it. And as we've heard a lot on magic, I'm going to focus a little bit more on a practiced, everyday form of magic through my presentation, namely ritual, in relation to the installations of artist Betye Saar. All right. In 1980, artist Betye Saar developed and exhibited her first site-specific installation, Secrets and Revelations, at the Studio Museum in Harlem in New York. Palm fronds and circuit boards are scattered across a wall in a rhythmic pattern. Devotional objects and incense are arranged around a small altar, which you see here. On the wall across from the altar, we see a painted shadow silhouette of the artist lighting a candle. It's a simple ritual gesture that the viewer gets to witness here and an intimate moment of introspection. Through the silhouetted shadow, a visitor may imagine themselves in the place of the artist, activating the altar and filling the space of reflection with their own associations and affective responses. Secrets and Revelations was part of Saar's 1980 solo exhibition, also called Rituals, at the Studio Museum. And her artist statement for the show explicitly notes that the installations are, quote, executed as ritual. The accompanying exhibition catalog also includes a poem by Saar that is also titled Ritual. And I'm just going to read out part of it to you. From the past, the essence of a cumulative consciousness, the remnants of lost ceremonies, the loosening and unwrapping of mystery, the emergence from shadows to face the unknown. So Saar here frames ritual as a pathway to tap into the unknown, the unconscious, and a past that may not be known, but may still be connected with. Born in Los Angeles in 1926, so Betye Saar is 99 and a half. Betye Saar is an artist who has been working for over 7 decades across various media. She's best known for assemblages, most prominently for Black Girl Window from 1969 and The Liberation of Aunt Jemima from 1972, both works that focus on Black empowered female subjectivity and dismantling racist stereotypes. Activist and scholar Angela Davis remarked on Saar's The Liberation of Aunt Jemima in particular that seeing this piece in 1972 for her marked the beginning of a black feminist movement. While these works have since been really firmly anchored in an art historical canon, and Saar's name today really is synonymous with black feminist art, she has developed this substantial body of work which is less recognized and historicized, which are her installations, and that were the focus of Serious Moonlight in 2021. So since 1980, Saar has created this over 40 room-size installations, and the installations not only mark a spatial expansion of her assemblages into quote, walk-in boxes, as curator Laurie Stokes Sims has called them, but also foreground the concept of art making as ritual. So as Saar moves from wall-based works to freestanding and more immersive environments, I'll just show you one of these here. As she marks into installations, the ritual emerged not only as a recurring theme within the installation, but as also an underlying principle guiding the creation and organization of these pieces. To give you a bit more background on ritual, so Saar herself in her catalog for the Studio Museum in Harlem had featured a definition of what ritual means to her, which is from a very popular book from the 70s. It's called The Dictionary of Mysticism from Frank Gaynor. And so, quote, ritual is a prescribed series or set of ceremonies, rites, acts, words, gestures, etc., determining by considerations of tradition and symbolism. And if you add more contemporary definitions by sociologist Clifford Geertz, who, for instance, describes ritual as a mediation and synthesis between thought and action, as well as Mary Douglas, who frames ritual as a form of communication, this really emphasized the communicative quality of ritual that Saar's installations feature, as they function as interpersonal mediations and as a bridge between thought and action that I want to focus on in more detail here. So in a 1999 interview, Saar clarifies that ritual does not necessarily have to have a spiritual or religious reference. For her, it's rather a form of reflection and introspection as much as it provides a connective tissue. And I quote Betty, "I'm not interested in studying formal ritual as much as the everyday rituals that people use. Things as ordinary as what you do when you get up in the morning before you eat, how you get dressed to go out, or personal altars like a woman's dressing table, what people hang from their mirror or place on the dashboard of their automobiles, or things they buy and put in their kitchen shelves. Unless people live in a sterile existence and don't like to collect things, they always have some sort of altar structure in their life," end quote. So rituals really surrounds us, and we practice manifold rituals in our own everyday lives, from our morning coffee to bedtime reading. Given its ubiquity, ritual is more than just a topic in Saar's installations and altar pieces. Instead, the making of the works themselves for her becomes a form of ritual. Departing from the dominant conventions and rhetoric of contemporary art production at the time, Saar turned to ritual as an alternative framework for both the making and the reception of her installations. By conceiving and assembling her installations as ritual practice, I will argue, Saar fundamentally shifts the term of what these works are and potentially what they can do. So also in the catalog for the ritual exhibition, Saar really spells out and gives a detailed account of the sequential steps that structure the making of the installations or the ritual process, that is. So there's first the imprint, the ideas, thoughts, memories, and dreams from the past, present, and future. Then second, the search, what Saar describes as a selective eye and intuition. And in third place, the collecting, gathering, accumulating, transforming of materials. This is what brings presence and energy. That's a quote from Saar. And these materials can include old, new, and organic materials, as well as things she will collect on travels or also her own artworks. And finally, there's a release, which is a very important part, which actually involves the audience. So it's the last step where the ritual is completed, and this is no longer in the hands of the artist. So in the light of these 4 steps, what does it mean to create a work of art, specifically an installation, as ritual? And I would like to break this down into 3 aspects. So first, if we think of art making as a form of ritual, then ritual also becomes a form of world building. Second, if ritual emphasizes, ritual emphasizes process over finished material outcome. And finally, in third place, ritual is a form of embodied knowledge. I'll go back to this installation, which is called House of Fortune. So if ritual is a form of world building, this is a great example. It's an installation that you see here in the exhibition in Miami from a few years ago, but it was first staged in 1988 in Manila, Philippines, as part of an exhibition tour that Saar did through Southeast Asia. House of Fortune features a 1920s Art Deco table and 4 chairs at its center that were purchased by the artist at the Rose Bowl flea market in Los Angeles. So that's part of her search process. The table is adorned with the artist's handprints and ancient rules, as well as astrological signs burned into the legs of the chairs and tables. They're set into a thick layer of branches, or in this case, palm fronds, covering the floor. A deck of tarot cards, and actually in relation to yesterday's talk, the deck of tarot cards is Aleister Crowley. And I assume it was bought at a flea market, like many of the objects that Saar includes, because in installing it, I realized there are really traces of use, like some are a little folded up. So I assume it was a deck that was used by someone before. So 4 painted silk banners reference the 4 elements. You see them here. There's 3 of them. The 4th one is out of the picture, but you have the air, fire, and earth, and water is at the back of the viewer. The adjacent walls, painted dark blue, display a group of sequin flags, as well as a group of works made from paper pulp. Saar describes the theme of House of Fortune as follows, quote, "The quest for knowledge of one's destiny exists in all cultures. Numerous methods, devices, and symbols have attempted to reveal the unknown. The installation House of Fortune summons the viewer to enter, to see, to hear, to experience, and perhaps to conjure the future." At first sight, the entire setting is reminiscent of a seance, so a 19th century spiritualist practice that thought to communicate with the dead. But if you look closer, there's a variety of references included here. So House of Fortune assembles materials and works of art that each point to different ritual practices of revealing the unknown, seeing into the future, or connecting with spirits, from tarot to alchemy, from astrology to voodoo. It's less a collection of objects, but more a syncretic world entirely of its own. And I like to draw a particular attention here to one specific aspect of the installation, which are these sequin flags that you see here. And for these works, Saar actually adapted the already syncretic form of the Haitian voodoo flag. So voodoo flags, or drapo vodou, are originally displayed in voodoo temples in Haiti, and they later, so from the 1940s, 1950s on, they became more of an independent art form that was appreciated and collected by many visitors coming to Haiti. To give you a bit of background, so voodoo religion was first established in Haiti by enslaved West and Central Africans who were forcibly brought to the island starting in the 16th century, which is historical genesis complexly intertwined with slavery and colonialism. It combines belief systems and spiritual practices from African Yoruba, Dahomian, and Bakongo traditions with attributes of the Roman Catholic Church. As the conversion to Catholicism was mandatory by the colonial rule and voodoo rituals were forced into obscurity, many voodoo deities appear as syncretized representations of Catholic saints in these voodoo flags. And here you see 2 examples. So voodoo flags, for instance, adapt St. Patrick for the snake god Dambala, or the Polish Black Madonna, which you see here on the left, for Ezuli Dantor, which is, in this case, a contemporary piece by Haitian artist Merlin Constant. And the other one shows a more Veve pattern by sequin artist Georges Valris. Saar first encountered the voodoo flags actually upon visiting Haiti in 1972 and 78, and was fascinated with the spiritually charged and creolized art form. Approximately 10 years later, she commissioned the Haitian voodoo priest and distinguished sequin artist Clotaire Basile to produce a series of flags using her own motifs. However, rather than using the syncretized saints of Catholicism along with Veve symbols that usually would adorn these flags, Saar's flags are irregularly shaped, and they also include her own mystical and spiritual iconography. And here you see 3 examples. In delicate beadwork and densely stacked sequins, the flags picture symbols of chants that reoccur in Saar's works throughout the decades. So some have dice, moons, celestial bodies. You see here a fish jumping through a fan and a flaming heart. Each symbols of transcendence or pointing towards the future. You also have the handprints on the seance table, and it's a little bit hard to see, but I give you here. So you have the handprints here, and then you see the runes and astrological signs, and some of them are Nordic runes, others are from Nigeria, so they don't really form a cohesive narrative or sentence, but it's really more about visitors recognizing fragments that they are familiar with. And so Saar herself notes, quote, "The ritual series deals with rites that are made up. It's not that I'm emulating Haitian voodoo or New Orleans hoodoo or Chango or Santeria or any of the different cults. It's just like, I just take a little bit from each one. Basically, it's one planet and how everybody contributes to that, end of quote. Saar's installation reflect the artist's own world and an alternative cosmology that invites viewers into its imaginative terrain, which is both highly subjective as it is multivocal and cross-cultural. And this brings me to my second argument, the emphasis of process over a fixed material outcome. So what is really unique about these installations is that Saar does not conceive of them as final or static assembles of objects. The work really changes in every iteration, and after an installation has been exhibited, objects or smaller scale artworks might travel across different installations. They might reappear over decades or maybe be exhibited on a completely different title and premise. So within these shifting constellations, the objects make on different constellations and meaning, connotations and meaning, sorry. So to stay with House of Fortune, I will give a few examples here. It always uses the same chair and table ensemble, but it is combined with different objects. So we see here the first iteration of House of Fortune in Manila at the US Embassy. And then as part of the same exhibition tour, it was actually shown a year later under a different title. So the second iteration from 1989 was in New Zealand, and that actually uses this large silk banner you see in the backdrop on the right side, titled Celestial Universe, a star-studded night sky that displays different star constellations and astrological signs. So what distinguishes Fragments of Fate from House of Fortune is not really a shift in Saar's underlying concerns, but in the symbolic vocabularies through which she expresses them. Both installations center on technologies for accessing what lies beyond ordinary perception, yet each mobilizes a different set of references. In House of Fortune, the 4 element banners, voodoo flags, and tarot cards evoke a broad cosmological image of fortune and fate, one that remains deliberately abstract and open-ended. For Fragments of Fate, the cosmological field becomes more individualized with the zodiac signs and star constellations, And you see very small here, at the center of the table, a large crystal ball appears, offering a more explicitly personalized means of approaching the unknown. So together, these two iterations really reveal how Saar recomposes the same conceptual terrain, divination, fate, and speculative knowledge through shifting constellations of objects. And they each form, well, each version opens a distinct cosmological frame while remaining tethered to the same underlying question, how do we tune ourselves to what cannot be seen? So in another iteration, here you see again fragments of fate, but then 3 years later, the same ensemble is exhibited under the title of Matter and Spirit, which still incorporates the same copper glove molds holding the tarot cards, but for the first time of Matter and Spirit was actually part of a group exhibition, which makes for an interesting context. So this exhibition was titled Migrations of Meaning, and it was shown at Intar Gallery in New York in '92, bringing together works that engage with processes of creolization and the layering of cultural practices framed through the lens of a yard show, which is a vernacular African diasporic tradition mostly found in the United States. And so, responding to the overall theme of the show, Saar actually added another sculpture, which is a small chair suspended from the ceiling across from this installation. And she called that piece Spirit Chair. So within yard show displays, seats and chairs are one of the recurring themes that serve as a symbol for, quote, sitting with visionary experience, powers of deities or spirits or persons, and the continuing influence in this world of deceased leaders and ancestors, end quote, as anthropologist Gray Gundaka writes. With the Spirit Chair sculpture, Saar establishes a direct link to the African diasporic practice of the yard show, and Spirit Chairs particularly are a form that traveled or was brought across the Middle Passage and is found in many African diasporic communities. So through the addition of the Spirit Chair, Saar reframes and repositions the entire installation in closer connection to themes of creolization and the aesthetic traditions of the African diaspora than previous iterations, inviting the viewer to consider her installation as a yard show of thoughts. And here I'm just want to give you an example of another variation. So this is actually the same installation across the more recent exhibition in Metz and Miami, and you see that the organic materials also change with every... Sorry, I need water. Should have opened this before. Thank you. Okay, better. In Miami, obviously it was palm trees because it's Miami. And then in Metz, it was willow branches. So it's always the most common organic material found in a space. I think it was shown in Arizona was tumbleweed. So while Saar's installations vary across decades and exhibition contexts, they are grounded in a set of formal principles that she consistently upholds, principles that extend beyond the fact that each of the work is conceived as ritual. So there's actually another aspect here that I want to draw attention to, and this is the concept of power and display. And this is something that Saar first experienced through the African art scholar Arnold Rubin. He published a very influential article in 1975 in Art Forum that was focused on African sculpture and was titled Accumulation, Power and Display in African Sculpture. And in that, Rubin describes how accumulative sculptures generate meaning through the gradual layering of power and display materials, each contributing to a spiritual potency, social significance, and communal memory. So adapting this principle of African sculpture to her installations, Saar includes display elements that have a more decorative function in order to what Saar calls, quote, seduce viewers, but also power elements. And recently in an interview, Saar remarked, quote, "The display is the artwork, but the way it's put together creates the power. Putting pieces together and seeing what that feeling is like, having the viewer look at them and experience something," end quote. So borrowing from principles dominant in African sculpture, Saar thinks of her installations not only outside of dominant discourses of Western contemporary art, but also embraces a concept of art that focuses more on community and communal experience rather than the work of art as a contained and static object that is passed through exhibition spaces. Privileging process over finalized product, the installation doesn't exist as minutely recorded compilation of objects, but is rather a dynamic and contemporary constellation that will change according to their context and exhibition venue as they encounter their audiences. So the processual nature brings me to my third and final point about art making as ritual. With ritual being a form of embodied knowledge, the installations are not only experienced visually, but also viscerally. This occurs on dual registers. So first, more immediate, there's a somatic level with elements of sense, sound, and movement that actually Saar introduces into the installations. Some, for instance, include the sound of ocean waves that she records and are shown along a modified canoe. Others open the windows and let wind come in so that wind chimes are activated and ring. There's rocking chairs that move, that have like a small mechanical device that moves them. Others again use rosebuds or dried leaves that fill the air with a subtle smell. So beyond the sensorial and somatic aspect, there is also the invitation for the viewers to participate and activate the installations themselves. This can simply be the fact that they move through an installation, walking through the exhibition space akin to a stage, or as Saar puts it, quote, "An installation for me suggests a theatrical environment. The viewer is a participant in a play or a scene. When I create an installation, I want a viewer to be involved just by walking through. They're not an actor, but how they react to the environment, that's the action of the play," end quote. So Saar's installation also invite a more direct participation, actually, rather than just walk through, and at times they really invite viewers to explicitly participate in ritual. So the installations actually grew out of the form of the altar, and here we see the very first altar piece Betye Saar made in 1973, which is called Umti. It is an assemblage of 2 boxes and different found objects on a ready-made palm front table. When Umti was exhibited, viewers spontaneously began to leave offerings at the sculpture's base. For the next exhibition of the piece 4 years later, in 1977, Saar actually incorporated the spontaneous gesture, changing the title to Umti Receives, and explicitly now inviting viewers to leave tokens during the exhibition. And it also actually included that they could reclaim and exchange them at the end of the show. So over the years, Saar designated actually different installations to function as altars. And in the series Moonlight exhibition, this role was taken up by the piece Wings of Morning. And here you see an example with the offerings. Saar formalized the gesture with actually a wall text inviting visitors to leave something in memory of someone they had lost. By making this ritual exchange part of the installation, viewer participation becomes an integral part of the artwork rather than an added layer. And crucially, some of these offerings will later actually appear in Saar's own assemblages, meaning that audience contributions not only activate the piece, but also to continue to live on in future works. So through this ritual exchange and expanded framework of reception, the experience of Saar's work reaches beyond the visual and draws on the viewer's presence and their situational and affective dimension. Just as the installations themselves are never static, the process of assembling and encountering them is marked by uncertainty and guided as much by intuition as by formal considerations. So Saar notes, an installation is not complete until, quote, You put the last piece in, or light the candle, or plug the light in if it's neon, end quote. The work emerges through a ritual process that relies, quote, on your own personal mojo, your spirit guides to lead you, end quote. So hence, ritual really becomes a form of embodied knowledge, something that must be enacted and felt in physical space in direct relation to the installations themselves, rather than understood solely through conceptual or visual analysis. And to conclude the presentation, I want to really emphasize that Saar is not the only artist at the time embracing rituals. As you will see later this afternoon, there was a whole group of artists working in Los Angeles in the late 1970s and 1980s that featured ritual in their work. And so Barbara McCullough's film, Shopping Back Spirits and Freeway Fetishes, Reflections on Ritual Space, documents this group of Black artists working in Los Angeles, including David Hammonds, Houston Connell, and Senga Ngudi, along with Saar herself, who all foreground ritual as alternative modes of art making. So as McCullough actually traces in her film, ritual gained prominence among African-American artists as it provided the means to create connection and community through and around their works. This creative impulse aligned with theories of Black art practices that evolved at the time. By 1972, actual cultural critic and intellectual father of the Black arts movement, Larry Neal, had outlined, quote, spirit worship, orishas, ancestors, African gods, syncretism, and Catholic voodoo as categories and elements that constituted a Black aesthetic outlook, end quote. So ritual here really becomes a form to narrate something that is not indebted to hegemonic discourses or prevailing art norms at the time, but to what scholar Saidiya Hartman calls radical imagination. And echoing Hartman's approach, curator Zoe Whitley, one of the curators of the exhibition Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power, writes, quote, creating and performing new rituals, the artists also gained strength from the idea that their practices were anchored in ceremonies performed by unknowable ancestors before them. So this is one really important aspect. And then there's yet another dimension that I also wanted to mention, which is in turning towards ritual that also involved, in Betye Saar's case, a rejection of the economy of the art market and the forms of art privileged at the time. So in the early 90s, she talked about why she started doing installations and embraced ritual, and she calls it herself, quote, a pretty daring move, facing an increasingly commercialized art world dominated by blue chip, mostly white male artists. And as she explained, quote, if I don't like what I'm seeing, then I shouldn't be part of it. I should put my art where my mouth is, just move away and do your thing another way. I really wanted to explore installation art. It was more of a challenge, end quote. So by refusing the logic of the art market and the mechanisms of commodification and instead embracing the ritual dimension of the installations, Saar aligned her practice with forms of cultural resistance that privileged process over product. Through ritual, her installations positioned the artist as an active and enduring presence within the work while simultaneously establishing the audience as a community gathered around it. So in Saar's artistic practice, ritual becomes a mode of artistic sovereignty, how to make art, how to share it, and how to gather around it. By privileging process, intuition, and communal experience, Saar's installation model an alternative practice that reminds us of the generative power of ritual and imagining other ways of creating and belonging in this world.
Thank you, Stephanie. This was absolutely fascinating. Maybe while we wait for questions, just a first question, which I think maybe echoes two of the elements that you started laying out in your conclusion. I think it's very interesting the way that you show these different moments also in Saar's practice. But could you tell us a bit about the reception? Because it would be interesting to hear you speak of how the reception changed over time, and that now that you also, for example, cite works by contemporary scholars like Saidiya Hartman, and shows also how Betye Saar is very much related to the younger generation also of artists. So I'm curious to know if you have like a take on that, like evolution of the reception of her work, both in the US and outside of the US.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, it's a huge field, but I feel what was interesting with the installations is actually she was so well known for her assemblages in the US, but the first installations were actually all presented in Southeast Asia. So she really came up with the form of the installation as a way to easily travel her work, and then present it to communities outside of the US. And she talks a lot about that. So there was Manila, Taiwan, New Zealand, and I forget the other venue, but she talks in an interview about how artists from Tibet came up to her and asked her how she knows so much about Tibetan art, which for her was really, her goal was to make something that also is understood and presented outside of this context of Black American art, which she's very much embedded in, and African diaspora is such an important theme, but she really also always wanted to create or incorporate references that could be understood in a very different way. In Malaysia, she had a Malaysian traditional puppet theater perform in her installation. So really incorporates references that are truly global, but at the same time, I think with her it's also interesting because there is the reference to Angela Davis. She was friends or is friends with David Hammonds, and they worked at the same time. And in Los Angeles, she lived in Laurel Canyon at the time, which was very hippie. I mean, now it's much more part of the city, but Frank Zappa was there, and it was all this alternative belief systems. And she was also consuming a lot of these. She said in an interview that she made her students read Joseph Campbell's The Power of Myth. But then when you look at the 80s and 90s, I think she comes to a more specific aspect of the African diaspora again, where the Brooks slave ship diagram starts appearing again, also in the installations. And it's also a time where Paul Gilroy writes about the Black Atlantic. And I feel that really develops in parallel almost. I mean, I found in her archives references to Robert Ferris Thompson, who wrote the book Flash of a Spirit, who was the first scholar really to emphasize the continuities of African aesthetic practices across the Middle Passage into the US. So the spirit share, there's actually a note to Robert Thompson's explicitly. And I think with Saidiya Hartman is someone so important in the idea of the fugitive and the speculative and radical imagination. And I think a lot of it resonates so closely with it. But yeah.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Bien sûr, je traduirai.
Merci pour votre présentation. Moi, je me demandais, autant la question communautaire est très claire dans la manière dont elle s'inscrit dans l'œuvre pour Mti ou Wings of Morning, autant la manière dont le public est impliqué dans House of Fortune ou Fragments of Fate est moins claire pour moi. Est-ce qu'il y avait une dimension performative aussi qui faisait suite à ces installations ou pas ?
While the community aspect was very important in the Umti installations, the second set of installations seems to highlight the public participation more. Et c'était quoi la dernière partie? Yes, was there like an explicit element of performative installing that implicated or called for a participation from the public? Is that clear?
Outside of the altar pieces.
In House of Fortune.
In House of Fortune. No, there's no activation that way. I mean, you have the empty chairs, but you're not supposed to sit on them. But it is, for me, I feel it's really a stand-in of the body, and rather than giving any explicit depictions of a body, I think there are the empty chairs and there's also the shadows. So it's more an invitation to have an imaginary participation. But with the Umti, I think actually when Umti Received was first exhibited, one of the visitors actually performed a dance as a gift in front of the altar. So there are these activations.
Unexpected activations, right.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have one question, but maybe in two moments, about her relation with other art movement. I'm thinking, of course, of land art, which development in the 70s is very prominent in this part of the world. And is there in her work attempts of going out of the art institution in this also idea of circulation between the inside and the outside? And I guess I have a little bit the same question about did she experience, for example, a way of escaping the authorship in maybe more collective practices? So you were mentioning this community of artists working in simultaneously close question. Did they work together at some point and as maybe a collective of artists?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Los Angeles at the time, so actually in the 1960s, Saar never really explicitly made art outdoors. For her, an important reference are also all the vernacular artists working in Los Angeles. So you have like Grandma Prisby's Bottle Village. I know she took her class there. So she taught at Parsons and Otis in Los Angeles. And actually Carrie James Marshall was also one of her students. Now I lost what I wanted to say. I mean, collectively, she didn't really... It's always authored by her still. And she was part of a larger installation in the late 60s in Los Angeles called the Artist Protest Peace Tower. That was initiated by Mark de Souvero and Irvin Petlin, that I think gathered hundreds of artists contributing small collages. And Betye was actually one of them, which I find really interesting because it was one of the early examples also of a form of protest that operated across racial divisions and that kind of took inspiration from the Watts Towers, which was a very important cultural moment in 1965 in Los Angeles, which was the Watts Rebellion was a massive protest of the majority black inhabitants of the town of Watts against police violence. And so that was important momentum of using art also as a social practice that then carried on to protesting the Vietnam War. But in terms of land art, I mean, yeah, I think it's interesting to see Betye also in a community that is extremely diverse in Los Angeles and someone who's worked and lived in this community for worked for over 70 years and lived there for her entire life, basically.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for the presentation. I have a question about the installation Muti and the offerings that were left as part of the installation or they were given to the installation. How was he approaching the offerings? How was he documenting the offerings and whether she was looking at what has been left later on, reflecting on maybe the intentions of people? And how was she was then deciding to rearrange some of them in later installations? What kind of process was she following for this?
Yeah, I think so. It always changes a little bit, but I think with Receives, there was like I found an invitation card in her archives where it particularly says the last day of the exhibition come at this time of the day, and you can select and pick things. And then others, I mean, there's no clear trace. I do know that some reappear, and one of the joys of being a curator of these exhibitions is that at the end of the show, I got to pack up all the offerings, and they were shipped actually in this case from Miami to Metz and Lucerne. So it started getting more and more and more, and actually got pretty full. And it was really interesting because some were very Miami specific. I mean, there definitely was a snake skin in the Miami offerings, but someone also really brought like old, what do you call them, cufflinks from someone. So there were really like emotionally charged objects. You know, others will leave like a movie ticket or something, but there was a whole range. And yeah, I shipped it all back to Betty at the end of the shows, and I know it's in her studio. And I mean, you can, if you Google, there's photos of her studio, which is just an incredible archive of objects that has decades and decades of collected objects that eventually will turn up again in installations.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question because I have trouble understanding how in House of Fortune she justify using so much different symbols from different practices and different cultures, like Haitian vodou, Nordic runes, alchemy, astrology, tarot, anything like that. Like, do you maybe could explain more in details, like if she had like an explanation for this?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as she said in the quote I read, for her it's really it's a highly subjective selection, and it's different things she will encounter, but it's really showing that ritual is not something specific to one culture, but it is something that is inherent to any culture, and it can take incredibly different forms, like, yeah, as you said, runes or voodoo flags, but they're all expression of ritual. And this ritual also has different means and there's different ends to it, but it is the shared practice that she really wants to gather in this installation and combine to really, it makes a world of her own, but it also really emphasizes that ritual exists everywhere and it's not specific to any culture.
Maybe just one remark on that, because you're linked to the first answer that you gave in relationship to Betty's work, was being influenced by like contemporary Black studies, for example. I think that this syncretism, or the way that she freely kind of took from different ritual, different cultures, is also maybe very much linked to the Black American experience at that time. And she wasn't the only artist kind of just gathering, because it also shows the specific political moment in a way.
Yeah, definitely, I agree. But yeah, it's definitely that aspect. And then also just to add, I think it's a very Californian experience too, because it was just a city that, of course, you know, Jim Crow existed till the 60s, but I think in California it is a little more porous, the culture and and it was a very important moment also for the Black arts movement in Los Angeles, that she was so closely connected to, but then also California is, just as we heard yesterday, a place of New Age culture.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you for your answers.